Could a simple winter fog in London become so thick that people got lost on their own doorsteps? The Victorian era, which we imagine in the glow of gas lamps and lavish dresses, had another side, especially in winter. It was a time when the cold was not just an inconvenience, but a daily ordeal for millions. Surviving the potentially dangerous winter months required ingenuity, endurance, and large amounts of coal. Every home, from luxurious mansions to damp basements, fought a desperate battle for warmth. Watch the video to the end to learn how ice could form on the walls inside bedrooms and what invisible dangers a regular fireplace could hold. What I am about to tell you will change your perception of London fog. It was not just fog, but a phenomenon known as pea super. It had a distinctive yellowish-brown color and a thick, oily texture. This fog was so dense that visibility dropped to a few meters. People couldn't see their own feet when walking down the street. Traffic in the city came to a virtual standstill. The main cause of this phenomenon was coal, the primary fuel of the era. Millions of fireplaces in homes, factories, and plants spewed tons of soot and sulfuric smoke into the sky around the clock. These particles mixed with the natural river fog, forming acrid, suffocating smog. The air in the city took on a distinct smell of sulfur and burning. Getting around the city in such fog became a real challenge. Cabs and omnibuses stopped because the drivers could not see where to go. Pedestrians were forced to move along the walls of buildings so as not to get lost. Often, people who went to a store on a neighboring street would wander for hours looking for their way home. The fog penetrated everywhere, even into the richest and best protected houses. Acrid soot settled on furniture, carpets, and curtains. Housewives had to constantly fight this dirty coating. The air in the rooms became heavy and unpleasant to breathe. During the day, it could be so dark that gas lamps and indoor lighting had to be turned on. Street lighting was almost useless, as its light could not penetrate the thick veil. The lamps created only dim, ghostly halos in the yellow haze. This created a special, oppressive atmosphere. This smog also had serious consequences for the health of the city's residents. People with respiratory problems found it difficult to breathe. The fog exacerbated many ailments, and during periods of particularly heavy smog, the level of illness rose sharply. This was the price the city paid for industrial growth. The city authorities did little to combat this phenomenon. At that time, smoke from chimneys was considered a sign of prosperity and a functioning economy. Few people associated coal smoke with health problems. People perceived the fog as an inevitable evil, part of the London winter. Some enterprising individuals tried to profit from it. They offered their services as guides, leading lost pedestrians for a fee. But in general, the city simply froze, waiting for the wind to clear the air. This could last for several days in a row. The uniqueness of this phenomenon lay in its man-made nature. It was a direct result of how Victorians heated their homes. The struggle for warmth paradoxically made the urban environment even more hostile. Every lit fireplace added its share to the overall pollution. This thick, acrid atmosphere became the backdrop for many stories of that era. Do you think modern people could psychologically withstand living in such conditions when darkness falls in the middle of the day? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn more about the realities of the past. Are you ready to learn the truth about Victorian fireplaces that all the movies hide? The fireplace was the absolute center of the Victorian home, especially in winter. It was the only source of heat in most rooms. The whole life of the family was concentrated in the immediate vicinity of the fire. It was a place for socializing, eating, and working. Despite its central role, the fireplace was an extremely inefficient heating device. The vast majority of the heat, up to 80%, went straight up the chimney. This created a constant problem. To stay warm, you had to burn a huge amount of fuel. The room heated up very unevenly. A classic complaint of the Victorian era was roasted front and frozen back. People sitting by the fire felt intense heat from the fireplace, but their backs were freezing. This was because the fireplace, drawing out warm air, created a powerful draft of cold air from the cracks in the windows and doors. Maintaining the fire was a separate and laborious task. In wealthy homes, this was done by servants, and in poorer homes, by the residents themselves. Coal or wood had to be constantly added, and the ashes had to be regularly cleaned out. It was dirty and tedious work that had to be done several times a day. In wealthy homes, fireplaces were true works of art. They were decorated with carved marble, cast iron, and expensive tiles. However, this beauty did not affect their low thermal efficiency. A luxurious fireplace in the living room of a mansion heated as poorly as a simple hearth in a craftsman's house. Fireplaces in bedrooms were not always lit, especially in middle-class homes. It was considered wasteful to heat rooms where people only slept. Therefore, residents went to bed in cold beds, sometimes using hot water bottles or heated bricks. In poor areas, the situation was different. An entire family could live in one room, and a small hearth was their only hope. Fuel was expensive, so it was used sparingly. Often, coal was not used for heating, but rather any combustible rubbish, which only increased air pollution. The fire in the fireplace was not only a source of heat, but also the main way of cooking for many. They cooked, fried, and baked on an open fire or in cast iron stoves built into the fireplace. The smell of food mixed with smoke and soot. The danger of soot was real. Chimney sweeping was a necessity to avoid the accumulated soot-catching fire. This work was dirty and difficult, and it was critical to the safety of the home. A malfunctioning chimney could have dire consequences. The fireplace was a symbol of comfort, but at the same time, a symbol of struggle. What other household item was as important for survival? In the next chapter, we will talk about the fuel that fed these hearths and the price the city paid for it. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the Victorian economy. Coal was not just fuel, it was the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution. In winter, it became the main commodity that determined survival. The entire urban infrastructure was built around the extraction and delivery of this resource. The work of delivering coal was incredibly hard. Coal was brought in on barges along rivers and canals and then unloaded by hand. People known as coal men carried heavy sacks on their backs, climbing up rickety ladders. Their work was some of the most grueling and dirty in the city. After unloading, the coal went to coal merchants. They stored it in large warehouses, from where it was delivered to customers on horse-drawn carts. The streets of the cities were filled with the rumbling of these carts and the cries of merchants offering their wares. Coal was not all the same. There were different grades, which varied in quality and price. Wealthy households could afford sea coal, which burned for a long time and gave off a lot of heat. The poor had to make do with cheap coal or coal dust, which smoked heavily. Buying coal was a significant expense for any family. Poor families could not afford to buy a large supply for the winter. They bought coal in small portions, literally one bucket or bag at a time. This meant that they paid much more for it in terms of weight. There was a whole shadow economy associated with coal. People living near railways or canals collected pieces of coal that had fallen from barges or wagons. It was illegal, but often the only way to get fuel for free. Coal was a paradoxical resource. It provided heat and light, powered factories and moved trains. But it was also a source of dirt, smog, and social problems. Without it, the Victorian city could not have survived, but it was also what made life in it so difficult. If you enjoyed this unique look at an everyday object, please like this video. What if I told you that Victorians wore personal heating? The secret to surviving in cold and damp homes was clothing. The principle of layering was perfected. People wore several layers of underwear, shirts, vests, and dresses. Wool was the basis of their wardrobe. Unlike cotton, this material retains heat even when wet. Flannel and wool underwear was an essential part of winter clothing. It was worn by men and women of all classes. Men's suits were quite warm on their own. They consisted of woolen trousers, a vest, and a thick jacket or tailcoat. Underneath, men wore a shirt and often warm underwear. When going outside, they added a heavy coat and hat. Women's clothing was even more layered, although not always practical. Underneath the dress were numerous petticoats, a corset, pantaloons, and stockings. All these layers created an air gap that helped to retain heat. When going outside, women wore warm cloaks, capes, or coats, often with fur trim. Their heads were protected by hats, hoods, or warm scarves. Woolen shawls were incredibly popular and served as both a fashion accessory and additional insulation. All of these clothes were heavy and restricted movement. However, in conditions where the temperature in the room could not differ much from the temperature outside, they were a necessity. People literally wore their protection against the cold on their bodies. It was not customary to dress lightly at home. Even indoors, people wore vests, jackets, and warm dresses. They only took off their outer clothing. This was the norm, dictated by climatic conditions. There was a huge difference in clothing between the classes. The rich could afford high-quality wool, silk, and furs. The poor often wore clothes made of coarse fabric, patched and resewn, but the principle of layering remained the same. Gloves and muffs were used to protect the hands. The feet were kept warm with thick woolen stockings and sturdy boots. Keeping the feet warm and dry was one of the main tasks, as wet feet quickly led to illness. Thus, the Victorian wardrobe was a real fortress. It was designed not so much for beauty as for survival. Each layer of clothing served its own function, creating a cocoon of warmth around the body. How comfortable do you think this armor was in everyday life? In the next chapter, we will see how this struggle for warmth differed across different social classes. Winter in the Victorian era was different for everyone. For a wealthy industrialist or aristocrat, it was a time of balls, receptions, and cozy evenings by the fireplace. For a worker in the slums, it was an annual struggle for survival. The gap between the classes became particularly noticeable with the onset of cold weather. A wealthy mansion had many fireplaces, and no expense was spared in maintaining them. From early morning, servants lit fires in bedrooms, living rooms, and libraries. Coal supplies were stored in large cellars and lasted throughout the winter. Despite this, even in wealthy homes, it was not always warm. Huge rooms with high ceilings were difficult to heat. Drafts blew through the long corridors, but the residents had means of protection: thick carpets, heavy velvet curtains, and high-quality warm clothing. The rich people's diet also contributed to their survival. Hot soups, roasted meat, puddings, high-calorie foods gave the body the energy it needed. Hot tea, coffee, and other drinks helped warm them up from the inside. At the other end of the spectrum were the poor urban neighborhoods. Here, entire families huddled together in one small, poorly ventilated room. Often it was a damp basement or attic with a leaky roof. Such dwellings had neither carpets nor thick curtains. Heating in such rooms was a luxury. A tiny fireplace or cast iron stove was lit irregularly. Coal was too expensive, so anything that could burn was used. Broken furniture, rubbish, dry waste. This made the air in the room even more harmful. Often, the only source of heat was the warmth of the residents themselves. People slept together on the floor, covered by a single tattered blanket. By morning, the water in the bucket by the bed could be covered with a crust of ice. Guess which piece of furniture was invented specifically to combat drafts? In Victorian homes where central heating was rare, the main enemy was not so much the cold outside as the drafts inside. Cracks in the windows, gaps under the doors, and drafts from the fireplaces created a constant movement of cold air. Combating these drafts was part of everyday life. The simplest and most common remedy was heavy, thick curtains. They were made of velvet, tapestry, or other thick fabric, often lined. At night, the curtains were drawn tightly, creating a barrier between the room and the cold glass. Doors were also a source of problems. Special bolsters were used to block the flow of cold air from under the door. These long, fabric-filled sausages were placed along the threshold. They were found in every home, from poor to rich. In wealthy homes, screens were used to protect against drafts. They were placed near fireplaces to protect those sitting there from the cold air currents drawn in by the fire. Tall, multi-panel screens could also partition off part of a room, making it cozier and warmer. Furniture was arranged with drafts in mind. Armchairs and sofas were placed closer to the fire, but in such a way that they were protected by a screen. Beds in bedrooms often had canopies with thick curtains that were closed at night. This canopy created a microclimate, keeping the sleeping person warm. Carpets on the floor served not only a decorative function. A thick woolen carpet was an important element of thermal insulation. In houses where the floors were wooden and had gaps, a carpet was absolutely necessary. Windows were sealed for the winter. Cracks in the frames were filled with cotton wool or tow, or sealed with strips of fabric. It wasn't very aesthetically pleasing, but it helped to preserve precious heat. The cold was especially noticeable in bedrooms, which were often unheated. To warm up the icy bed before going to sleep, metal or ceramic hot water bottles were used. They were filled with hot water or hot coals, wrapped in cloth, and placed under the blanket. Glass was expensive and often thin in those days. Double glazing was rare. Therefore, window panes froze, covering the inside with a thick layer of ice and patterns. This whole protection system was improvised and not always effective. It required constant attention and effort. Life in a Victorian house was a constant tactical battle for every degree of heat. What was the main weapon in this battle, apart from coal? In the next chapter, we will take a look at the Victorian kitchen. Survival in winter depended not only on external sources of heat, but also on internal ones. The Victorian diet, especially during the cold season, was high in calories and filling. Food was fuel for the body, allowing it to produce its own heat. Meat was the staple of the winter diet. Roast beef, lamb chops, meat pies, and thick stews were on the tables of those who could afford them. Fatty meats provided the energy needed to combat the cold. Soups and broths were an integral part of the meal. Thick pea soup, rich meat broth, or root vegetable soup warmed and satisfied. For the poor, soup made from cheap scraps and vegetables was often the only hot meal of the day. Vegetables also played an important role. Root vegetables such as potatoes, turnips, carrots, and parsnips stored well during the winter. They were baked, boiled, and added to stews to make meals more filling. Breakfast was hearty to provide energy for the whole day. A typical middle-class breakfast might include porridge, eggs, bacon, smoked fish, and toast. It was a real fuel load for the body. Victorian winter homes were not only uncomfortable, but also posed hidden dangers. The building materials and structures of the time did not retain heat well. Brick walls were thin and lacked modern insulation. As a result, the walls froze through. On particularly cold nights, frost could form on the inside of the exterior walls. This was common even in middle-class homes. The main problem was dampness. Constant condensation from breathing and cooking settled on the cold walls. This created ideal conditions for mold growth. Black spots on the walls and ceiling were commonplace in many homes. This constant dampness combined with the cold had a detrimental effect on the well-being of the residents. Dampness permeated clothing, bedding, and furniture. It was almost impossible to dry anything completely. In poor neighborhoods, the situation was exacerbated by poor ventilation. In an attempt to keep warm, people plugged all the cracks. This led to the air in the room becoming stale and unhealthy, saturated with fumes and smoke from the stove. Not everyone had running water in those days, and where it did exist, it often froze. In winter, pipes laid along exterior walls or in unheated basements burst. This not only left homes without water, but also led to flooding. Sewage was also a problem. In poor areas, it was often non-existent. Waste was poured directly onto the street or into courtyards where it froze. This created an extremely unhealthy environment. Even in wealthy homes, plumbing and bathrooms were a source of cold. Bathrooms were rarely heated. Taking a bath in winter required a lot of courage and a lot of hot water. Winter completely changed the appearance of the Victorian city and the rhythm of its life. Snowfalls, which today paralyze megacities, were an even bigger problem in the 19th century. Snow removal techniques were virtually non-existent. The streets were cleared by hand, if at all. This was done by armies of unemployed people hired by the city authorities for a pittance. They shoveled snow and mud into huge piles on the side of the road, where they could lie for weeks. The main problem on the roads was ice. Streets covered with horse manure and mud turned into dangerous skating rinks when they froze. This made travel extremely difficult. Horses were the main means of transport. Animals often fell on icy pavements, breaking their legs. This was a common and depressing sight on winter streets. Coachmen sprinkled sand or ash on the road in front of their horses to improve traction. Omnibuses and cabs moved very slowly and with great caution. A journey that took half an hour in summer could take several hours in winter. Many people preferred to walk if possible. Pedestrians also had a hard time. Sidewalks were just as slippery. In addition, snow and ice fell from the roofs of houses. It was dangerous to walk under the eaves. Rivers and canals, which were important transport arteries, often froze in winter. This stopped the delivery of goods, including coal. During such periods, prices for fuel and food in the city rose sharply. Street life, so lively in summer, came to a standstill in winter. Street vendors, musicians, and other workers suffered from a lack of customers. The only ones who prospered were vendors selling hot food, baked potatoes, pies, or hot soup. Despite all the difficulties, the Victorian era was a time of progress. It was then that technologies began to emerge that would solve the problem of cold in the future. But in the 19th century, they were available only to a few. The first central heating systems were bulky and expensive. They ran on hot air or steam and were installed in the wealthiest mansions, hospitals, and public buildings. They were a novelty, not the norm. A more common innovation was the cast iron stove. Unlike an open fireplace, a closed stove was much more efficient. It gave off more heat into the room and used less fuel. Stoves were popular in middle-class homes, shops, and offices. Gas lighting, which appeared in cities, also contributed to heating. Gas lamps burned for hours, giving off a significant amount of heat. A side effect, however, was the burning of oxygen and soot on the ceiling. People sought not only entertainment, but also warmth in public places. Public libraries, museums, and galleries were often better heated than private homes. For many poor people, this was the only opportunity to warm up during the day. Charitable organizations tried to help. They opened soup kitchens where hot meals were distributed. Night shelters were also created where people could wait out the worst of the cold in warmth, albeit in very cramped conditions. Medicine began to recognize the link between cold, dampness, and illness. Doctors increasingly recommended ventilating rooms and keeping them dry. However, it was not always possible to follow their advice in practice. We can see that winter in the Victorian era was a real challenge that exposed all the contrasts in society. It was a daily struggle for both the rich and the poor, albeit with different weapons. The romantic image of snow-covered streets and cozy fireplaces hid a harsh reality: dampness, drafts, and a constant lack of heat. Survival in these conditions required enormous amounts of coal, which in turn created the famous deadly smog. It was an era when people learned to survive by wearing layers of clothing, eating hearty meals, and using simple tricks to combat drafts. This experience demonstrates the incredible resilience and ability of humans to adapt to the most difficult conditions. What other topics from the Victorian era or other historical periods would you like to see on our channel? Share your ideas in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next explorations of the past.